Story 1. John Harrison was a solitary genius who revolutionized open-sea navigation. Before him, finding longitude, meaning east-west position on Earth, was extraordinarily difficult. Determining longitude required clear skies, calm seas, a telescope, an observer, and complex calculations. Miss one day's observation and the ship could be lost at sea. Latitude was much easier to determine from the sun's highest point or from the stars. His solution to the longitude problem was a timekeeper for longitude, essentially a clock more accurately called a chronometer that kept time in two places, in London and on board the ship. Once high noon occurred in London, the London clock was set to 12. As the ship sailed west or east, the crew measured local noon and adjusted the shipboard clock at each observation. The difference between the two clocks allowed the crew to determine their east-west position relative to London. Even today, some seafaring terminology goes back to the minutes and hours style of speech that came from using Harrison's chronometers. Importantly, his clock did not use a pendulum, which most clocks of the time relied on because a pendulum would be affected by a ship's motion. Instead, he invented a governor that allowed a flat-coiled mainspring to unwind with constant force, driving a series of cogs that made the minute hand advance at regular intervals. The accuracy of Harrison's chronometers for the time was astonishing. Transatlantic tests showed his clocks would drift by only a few seconds per month. Remarkable for a mechanical timepiece even today. He was supposed to receive a financial reward from the Board of Longitude, but he never received the full payout because of politics. He continued improving his clocks for the rest of his life. Each revision increased accuracy and reduced size. Dava Sobel's book Longitude, the story of a lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his time, is an excellent and relatively short read. Highly recommended. Story 2. The invention of tetraethyl lead, used to prevent engine knocking, likely caused minor brain damage in the majority of the population. The alternative at the time was mixing ethanol into the fuel, so it likely set biofuel technology back decades. Story 3. In the late days of the July crisis of 1914, Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm exchanged telegrams through the night, known as the Willy-Nicky telegrams because they addressed each other as Willy and Nicky, concerning the possibility of war in Europe. During the exchange it became clear that neither wanted war, and immediately afterward the Tsar phoned the Russian war chief and told him to call off the general mobilization. The next day the Russian Army Chief of Staff and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Sazonov, tried to convince the Tsar to restart mobilization. During the ensuing argument the Tsar paused, staring out the window, when an aide-de-camp whispered, "We know it can be difficult for you to decide, Your Majesty." The remark struck Nicholas exactly the wrong way. Throughout his reign he had been called weak and indecisive and was seen as an incapable leader. Angered, he ordered the mobilization to resume. That single whispered sentence set the stage for the First Industrial War. The July crisis was a series of tragic and unfortunate events. Story 4. Toussaint Louverture sent a letter to Napoleon that directly compared the two men as equals. Napoleon was offended and sent an expedition to Haiti, then still a loyal French colony, to reimpose slavery. The expedition provoked a brutal war that France lost, resulting in Haitian independence. With the loss of Haiti considered the crown jewel of France's possessions in the Western Hemisphere, Napoleon lost interest in maintaining colonies there. He therefore pursued the Louisiana Purchase, an idea intended to generate revenue and weaken Britain. Without that letter, the United States of America might never have expanded beyond the Mississippi River. Story 5. After the war between the United States and Mexico under President Polk in 1848, Polk wanted to annex territory nearly to Mexico City, including all of Baja California and a line drawn east from its tip. His representative, Nicholas Trist, disagreed and proposed a much lighter settlement. Polk wanted negotiations held in Washington, D.C., and sent a notice to recall Trist, effectively firing him. In those days travel took weeks and was difficult. The men sent to recall Trist never found him, and he may have evaded the order. Trist defied Polk and negotiated the current southern border, which he considered just and sensible. Polk objected, but the Senate cared more about avoiding the costs of continued war and occupation than about extending a border across desert, and they ratified Trist's treaty. Had Polk's agents found Trist, The United States might have annexed nearly everything north of Mexico City. Story 6. In 1931, Hitler was investigated over the death of his niece Jelly, with whom he reportedly had an unhealthy obsession. She was shot in the chest with his gun in his apartment. Many people believed he was responsible for her death, but no charges were filed and the matter was swept under the rug after a while. Imagine an alternative history in which Hitler went to prison fairly early. Note: I know he was imprisoned later where he wrote Mein Kampf. I should have said remained in prison or went to prison on murder charges, something that might have kept him there. Story 7. We got Obama because a producer in Hollywood thought Garrett Wang was handsome. Not sure how much of this is apocryphal, but after a few seasons of Voyager, the producers wanted to shake things up. They decided to change the cast but could not decide whether to kill off Kes, a female character, or Harry Kim. Some producer thought Garrett Wang looked good on a recent television guide cover, so the character, who was in my humble opinion fairly boring, might still have some life in him. Kes was written out. Since they had removed a female character, they decided to add another, a sexy Borg played by Jeri Ryan. She was a huge hit and her profile rose considerably, so when she divorced her husband Jack Ryan it became news. Jack then ran for the United States Senate in Illinois, and details of his divorce went public, including how he pressured his then-wife to go to sex clubs. Because she was famous, this was big news, contributing to Ryan losing the primary to a little-known Barack Obama. All because Garrett Wang took a good picture one day. Story 8. During the 19th century, Russia occupied Poland and enforced limits on education, demanding that schools teach nothing beyond what was required for peasants. The Polish people established underground universities. One of the many graduates of these universities was Marie Curie. Story 9. Anthony Weiner sent explicit images to those teenagers. It reopened the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and now here we are. Story 10. At the Battle of Midway, the Japanese destroyer Arisher stayed behind to continue trying to sink the submarine United States ship Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese fleet all morning, while the rest of the fleet sailed on. At around 10 a.m., Arisher broke off the attack and raced to catch up with the main fleet, which was about 30 miles away. She was soon spotted by a large squadron of dive bombers from the carrier United States ship Enterprise. They had miscalculated their course and were almost forced to return to their ships without engaging the enemy. The bombers used Arisher to locate the main Japanese force and, in conjunction with a squadron from the carrier United States ship Yorktown that arrived over the Japanese fleet at the same time, found the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu just as those carriers were preparing to launch a major strike. Although a fourth carrier, Hiryu, survived that attack and launched a much-reduced counterstrike that inflicted major damage on United States ship Yorktown, leading to its sinking 3 days later. Hiryu was hunted down and destroyed by dive bombers later that day, eliminating the four-carrier strike force. If Arisher had not stayed behind, the dive bombers from United States ship Enterprise might not have found the Japanese carriers in time, and the carriers could have launched a devastating attack on the United States fleet, potentially changing the course of the Pacific War. Story 11. Mansa Musa went on a pilgrimage to Mecca and spent so much money in gold that he altered the North African and Mediterranean economies for decades. Story 12. The death of Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1818 ended the last hope for the Hanoverian line. Charlotte, the daughter of George IV, was very popular. After she died in childbirth, she and her stillborn son were greatly mourned. Her death prompted George IV brothers to end relationships with their mistresses, abandon many illegitimate children, marry princesses, and father legitimate heirs. One of these children later became Queen Victoria, known as the Grandmother of Europe. Story 13. Henry VIII's failure to produce a living son and the Pope's refusal to grant him a divorce were key factors. There were problems with the Church in England, but not enough on their own to cause the English Reformation. Henry himself drove the Reformation. If he had produced a living son or married Mary to James V of Scotland, his nephew, when she was young enough to have children, the outcome likely would have been different. Story 14. This may not be considered overlooked, but a Soviet radar operator during the Cold War saw multiple objects on his screen that could have been missiles from the United States. If he had reported them, the Soviet Union might have launched its missiles at the United States. He continued to observe, convinced it must be a mistake, and it turned out to be a false alarm caused by a technical malfunction. My explanation may not be accurate, as other commenters have pointed out. Story 15. In 1998, a paper was published in the British medical journal, The Lancet, titled Iliolymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. 12 years later, it was retracted amid reports of fraud, data manipulation, and conflicts of interest, and the paper's author was struck off the medical register. But the damage was done. Andrew Wakefield had linked the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine to autism in the claimed sense, not proven to be a causative link, and provided fuel to several movements, including anti-vaccine activists and those encouraging distrust of experts. The media amplified his findings, but without him, anti-vaccine beliefs might have remained fringe conspiracy theories, and Michael Gove would have been less able to declare that people have had enough of experts. Many people who later died might still be alive. Story 16. Cyrus the Great's decision to allow the Jewish people to return to Judea and to rebuild the Second Temple was pivotal. Without this, Judaism would likely have died out as a major world religion. Without Judaism, there would likely have been no Christianity and no Islam. There would surely have been other religions to take their place and other religious conflicts throughout the millennia. But when Christianity and Islam, in their many forms, together account for over 4.3 billion followers worldwide, it is hard to overstate how important that decision was in shaping the world thereafter. Story 17. If Obama had not roasted Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, we would likely never have had a President Trump. Story 18. The discovery of the potato directly led to the rise of the working class and multiple revolutions across Europe. Story 19. Ray Tomlinson sent the first electronic mail over the Advanced Research Projects Agency network in 1971. It was the first practical use of the newly developed file transfer protocol and a predecessor of what is now known colloquially as the Internet. Story 20. One tiny overlooked moment in history with significant consequences was the decision by a young unknown German soldier named Alfred Rhineland not to throw away his life on a futile charge during World War I. In October 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, Rhineland was ordered to lead a charge against enemy trenches. Seeing no chance of survival and questioning the senseless order, he hesitated and refused to go forward. The act saved his life but led to a court-martial and a death sentence. Because his commander recognized Rhineland's mental state, the sentence was commuted to 10 years in prison. After his release, Rhineland became friends with Erich Maria Remarque and shared his wartime experiences. Inspired by these conversations, Remarque wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, which provided a stark and poignant anti-war perspective that resonated worldwide. The novel was a huge success, selling more than 2.5 million copies in its first year, and adapted into an Academy Award-winning film in 1930. It helped shape public opinion about war and has continued to influence generations of readers and thinkers. That tiny overlooked moment thus had far-reaching consequences by helping to create one of the most powerful anti-war statements of the 20th century. Story 21. In the mid-1950s, Keith Tantlinger invented the twist lock and released the patent royalty-free. Today, nearly every object bought and sold on the planet is delivered in containers that are interchangeable and transportable because of this system. For this reason, I consider April 26, 1956 the most significant day of the 20th century, and possibly of the 21st century as well. Story 22. One overlooked development that is reshaping our world is the quiet revolution in battery technology, particularly sodium-ion batteries. While attention focuses on lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles, sodium-ion batteries could transform energy access for developing countries. 1. Unlike lithium, sodium is abundant and can be extracted from seawater. It is thousands of times more abundant than lithium. 2. Although they currently have lower energy density than lithium batteries, sodium-ion batteries are significantly cheaper, safer with lower fire risk, and perform better in cold temperatures. 3. Most importantly, they do not require mining rare earth materials or exploiting resources in politically unstable regions. We may be living through a moment future historians will see as a turning point, when energy storage became truly accessible to the global population, not just wealthy nations. Story 23. Nero joining the Battle of the Metaurus. Hasdrubal was sent by Carthage to help his brother Hannibal fight Rome during the Second Punic War. In Italy, he sent a messenger who was captured by the Romans. Nero was one of two Roman field commanders. The other, Marcus Livius Salinator, was his hated rival and was about to be trapped between two Carthaginian armies. All Nero had to do was wait for his main rival to be destroyed. But Nero chose to put Rome above personal ambition. Even had things gone differently, there is no certainty the brothers could have sacked Rome. Nor is it likely they could have actually held it even had they done so. It is almost certain that Rome would have survived in some form. Carthage simply did not have the strength to conquer Rome, but the Romans would have been forced to sue for peace, which would have bought Carthage time that it did not have after Metaurus. After Metaurus, Hannibal was never again able to threaten Rome, and 5 years later he would be defeated at Zama. After Zama, Carthage itself would never again threaten Rome and would be destroyed by Rome in the Third Punic War 50 years later. Had Nero chosen to stand pat, Carthage might have been given the time and resources necessary to complete their experiments in creating a new form of iron known as steel. At the time, both centers of research into steel production were in Carthaginian territory. Carthage had been working with local officials in Africa and Iberia to industrialize the process, but after the losses at Metaurus and Zama, they were too concerned about mere survival to follow up. What they had was hardly the Bessemer process, but had they developed even a primitive method for creating steel, Carthage likely would have survived, never strong enough to defeat Rome, but nevertheless too powerful to be defeated by Rome, acting as a counterweight to Roman domination throughout the Mediterranean world. Carthage was also a mercantile power, its economic strength tied to its fleet, while Rome was a land power, its wealth tied to the territory it held. Like many peoples and countries, Rome was at its best when faced with a powerful competitor. Competition would have forced the Romans to develop in ways they did not have to. Once their only serious opponent was destroyed, given the competition for resources and markets, it might have forced the Romans to remain a republic rather than be constrained by the rigidity of empire. To meet the challenge, slaves might have been presented the opportunity to purchase their freedom, and the Praetorians never permitted such power over the succession. The Romans had already developed a form of cement, and the availability of steel would have permitted greater, more elaborate construction efforts. Larger buildings, bridges, and roads, all needing something better than mere horsepower to construct on the scale that would then be possible. Roman engineers were masters of the art because stone is strong only in compression. Steel, however, is equally strong in both compression and tension, making it a far better material to use when constructing larger buildings, bridges, or almost anything else. There was a problem with steel, however. With the technology available at the time, they could have made enough to create a few swords. Making it in industrial quantities, however, required a lot of heat. Fueling the blast furnaces they would have needed to create large quantities of steel would have forced them to chop down every tree in Europe or to use coal. European coal sources were usually buried and often found well below the water table. For the Romans, getting rid of the water would have been a far more troublesome issue than mining the coal. Vast amounts of water would have had to be pumped out of the mines not just constantly but continuously, or it would build up. Pumping water 24 hours a day was extremely labor-intensive. The problem was so intractable that, in the timeline history actually followed, the issue was only resolved by the invention of mechanical pumps powered by steam engines, the same steam engines that would rapidly be used to power the Industrial Revolution. Nero's decision to violate his orders and rush to the aid of his rival was a tribute to his professionalism and honor. It was also a disaster for humanity in general. Had Nero chosen differently, the Dark Ages might never have occurred. The Industrial Revolution might have taken place over 1,000 years earlier than it actually did. Instead, Damascus steel would not be developed for another 1,200 years. The empire fell. All because one man chose to do his duty as his honor demanded. History had been decided along the shores of the Metaurus. I should note that I got this from my interesting quotes file. I am not the original author. Story 24. In the mid-1990s, Illinois businessman Jack Ryan took his actress wife, Jerry Ryan, to a sex club. While they were there, Jack asked his wife to have sex with him in the club where other clubgoers could have watched if so inclined. She refused. Years later, he ran for the United States Senate in Illinois as a Republican against little-known Democratic State Senator Barack Obama. Jack Ryan was considered a significant challenger for the seat. The Democratic political machine in Illinois found a sympathetic California judge who unsealed Jack and Jerry Ryan's previously sealed divorce papers against their wishes. When the sex club story came out, Jack dropped out of the race. Barack Obama became a United States senator and then president. He chose Joe Biden, a white, relatively moderate senator from an industrial state, as his running mate. At the White House Correspondents' Dinner during his second term, President Barack Obama mocked a thin-skinned billionaire celebrity businessman named Donald Trump, who was in the audience and had toyed with the idea of running for president for 30 years. Some say that night prompted Donald Trump to run for president. He went on to shock the world and win. Joe Biden, angry that he had been slighted by Obama, who had endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016, ran in 2020 and won. Joe Biden said he would pick a black woman as vice president, and he chose Kamala Harris. When Democrats forced Joe out of the 2024 race, he scuttled their idea of an open primary by immediately endorsing Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris ran against Donald Trump in 2024, and now Donald Trump will be president until January 2029. If Jack and Jerry Ryan's visit to the sex club had not happened or had gone differently, it is possible there would not have been President Barack Obama, President Donald Trump, or President Joe Biden. Story 25. 10,000 years ago, someone collected wild grass seeds in a clay pot that got wet. The seeds began to germinate, which turned the starches into sugars. The sugary water soon teemed with microorganisms. When the person discovered that the seeds were ruined, rather than throwing them out, they drank the contents. Thus beer was born, setting in motion the development of agriculture and, eventually, modern society. Story 26. Vasily Arkhipov was the sole dissenting voice who stopped a Soviet submarine from launching a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Story 27. The failed assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler on November 8, 1939, known as the Beer Hall Putsch bombing. Things could have been a lot different. Story 28. I am actually surprised how little we talk about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin at the hands of a right-wing Israeli extremist. Politics around the world have been marching backwards since that moment. Story 29. Many hundreds of years ago, either Quakers or Lutherans went around England giving Bibles to peasants. This spawned a class of literate peasants that eventually contributed to England becoming the world's leading power until the 20th century, when the United States took over. Story 30. In 1943, agricultural scientist Norman Borlaug planted a single hybrid dwarf wheat seed in Mexico. At the time, it seemed like just another experiment. However, that tiny act led to the Green Revolution and transformed global agriculture. By the 1960s, Borlaug's work had produced disease-resistant, high-yield crops that saved over 1 billion people from starvation in countries such as India and Pakistan. What looked like a small, insignificant moment ended up changing the course of history by reshaping global food security. Story 31. The radar operators in Hawaii detected Japanese aircraft approaching on December 7, 1941, reported it, and the warning was ignored. Story 32. John Frederick Parker sneaked off to the bar instead of remaining on post at the door of the presidential box at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. Story 33. When the Beatles quit touring to concentrate on making records, they changed popular music. Before that, most pop songs were shorter than 3 minutes and focused on love. The Beatles' decision to spend more time in the studio allowed them to explore and experiment, proving that innovative, non-formulaic music could sell. Without that decision, there might have been no Stairway to Heaven, no Bohemian Rhapsody, and perhaps no California Love. Story 34. That time Obama roasted Trump at the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner. I'm convinced that was the day Trump started to seriously consider the possibility of a real run for president after Obama said that could never happen. Thanks, Obama. Story 35. The failure of a message during the Battle of Antietam in 1862 during the American Civil War changed history. Union soldiers discovered a copy of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars, accidentally left behind by a Confederate courier. Known as Special Order 191, this error allowed Union General George McClellan to anticipate Lee's movements and stop the Confederate advance at Antietam. This moment of carelessness did not just affect a single battle. It helped prevent European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy and intervening in the war. That outcome preserved the Union and ultimately contributed to the abolition of slavery in the United States. A small, forgotten message on cigars changed the course of a nation. Story 36. I finally have an answer to one of these questions. A glassmaker in Venice was obsessed with making clear glass. It took him a while, but he finally found the right mixture. I think it included saltpeter. Clear glass enabled the creation of small transparent spherical lenses that, when combined, produced magnifying glasses and telescopes. It made possible beakers for testing chemicals and observing chemical reactions, and it led to the marine chronometer, which allowed ships to navigate more accurately. It contributed to better houses and taller buildings, and eventually to televisions, computers, and phones. It is one of the greatest innovations in human history, and many other major innovations stem from it. The glassmaker who figured it out had none of this in mind. He simply wanted to see how clear he could make glass. Story 37. The failure of the Darien colony, which bankrupted Scotland, was a direct precursor to the Act of Union. Without it, Scottish and British history would be very different. Story 38. I think the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy may have had a bigger impact on world events than the killing of John F. Kennedy. Many historians say Robert F. Kennedy did not have a realistic chance of winning in 1968, but suppose he had. If Robert F. Kennedy had won, Richard Nixon would not have become president. That could have prevented the Watergate scandal and the resulting widespread distrust of Washington. Insiders and Jimmy Carter may not have been elected. With a different and stronger Middle East policy, the subsequent events might not have occurred. No fall of the Shah of Iran, no Iran hostage crisis, no September 11, 2001 attacks, no 2 Gulf Wars, and possibly not the current Gaza war. Story 39. It may be obvious, but Archduke Franz Ferdinand's driver taking a wrong turn that day in 1914 changed the course of history. Story 40. The invention of the mechanical clock occurred in medieval monasteries. Initially created in the 13th century to regulate monastic prayer times, mechanical clocks soon spread beyond monastic walls and reshaped society's relationship with time. Before this, timekeeping relied on natural phenomena such as sundials and water clocks, which were imprecise. The mechanical clock introduced the concept of measured hours independent of nature and eventually influenced everything from work schedules to navigation and scientific discoveries. This small invention fundamentally shifted humanity's perception of time and contributed to the precision and efficiency associated with modern life. Story 41. It is not the most obscure event, but I think Al Gore conceding the 2000 election before the votes in Florida were fully counted sent us down a darker timeline. Imagine the progress we could have made on climate change if we had a world leader who took it so seriously more than 20 years ago. Story 42. An accidental numerical error in a research paper by Reinhardt and Rogoff went undiscovered while it dictated years of global economic policy. Who knows what shape the world would be in if the austerity measures of the 2010s had not been so credibly, albeit wrongly, supported by these influential academics. Story 43. The movie The China Syndrome is tied to the 3 Mile Island accident, which halted nuclear power development in the United States of America. Increased use of nuclear power and reduced use of coal would help mitigate global warming. Story 44. A delay meant that William of Normandy landed after Harold Hardrada, rather than before, in late 1066. If William had landed first, it is possible the English army would have defeated the Normans before having to race north to face the Norwegians, instead of the other way around. That sequence of events would likely have resulted in England falling into the Scandinavian orbit, focused on Northern Europe rather than becoming enmeshed with France and Southern Europe. Not only would the English language be radically different, but everything else would change, including a probable lack of interest in colonizing North America and thus not becoming the dominant power in the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. Story 45. The first recorded use of biological warfare occurred during the Mongol and Genoese conflict. Besiegers threw infected corpses into walled cities to spread disease. The unexpected consequence was the Black Death, which wiped out 1/3 of Europe and changed history immeasurably. Story 46. The first winter, the Pilgrims lived on the Mayflower. They were unable to build cabins because of cold weather and sickness. Two boys were playing and fired a gun in the gunpowder room. If a fire had broken out, the ship would have been lost along with all the families on board. The men were on land hunting. Story 47. The success of Americans rescuing hostages in Iran, along with American evangelicals voting for a military man who married his high school sweetheart, would have given Jimmy Carter a second term in the White House. There would have been no trickle-down economics and a different conservative movement. No Ronald Reagan. Story 48. Robert Fortune managed to smuggle live tea plants from China to India. It was the first domino in Britain's accumulation of wealth and expansion of empire. Story 49. If a lovesick German Morse code operator did not keep using his girlfriend's name as the test code word, Alan Turing may never have cracked Enigma and we would all be speaking German today. Story 50. The Battle of Haran in the Holy Land during the First Crusade stopped the Crusaders from advancing further east and ended the myth of the Franks' invincibility around 1101. Story 51. A doctor in China became infected with coronavirus disease 2019 and warned everyone that it could cause an outbreak. Sadly, he was ignored, and a pandemic followed. Story 52. Milton Hershey was supposed to return from his European travels on the Titanic, but was called home early for business matters and took the steamship America instead. This decision changed southern Pennsylvania and the chocolate industry as they are today. Story 53. Humankind's second greatest invention is string. You are even wearing the stuff right now. Story 54. In the 1970s, when major oil researchers discovered that burning fossil fuels was harming the environment beyond just air pollution, the American Petroleum Institute in the early 1980s confirmed this and informed the entire industry. The large American oil companies, such as Exxon, knew and chose to fund large disinformation campaigns. Congress knew as well in the 2000s. It has oil company documents on record as evidence. Oil company presidents remained in office, though. The oil companies acted like cigarette companies denying the harm from cigarette smoking and like automakers denying that much higher crash death rates are associated with not wearing seatbelts. One must hope that, although the oil companies and their leaders have already made enormous profits, we will have the wherewithal to hold someone to account. At this precarious point, it may be left to some future biblical story to vaguely recall a great man-made climate disruption. Story 55. In 1987, the United States government repealed the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was a law that required broadcasters to present issues of public importance fairly and to offer multiple viewpoints. When it was repealed, it contributed to the rise of right-wing radio, Fox News, and the broader right-wing media ecosystem. This arguably helped the rise of Donald Trump and the modern state of politics in the United States. Story 56. A certain applicant in 1908 was not accepted into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Story 57. Maybe not as tiny or as overlooked as others, but I am forever grateful to Dietrich von Koltitz for ignoring Hitler's order to destroy Paris as the liberating forces approached. Story 58. The Anglo-Saxons broke formation at Hastings. The entire world would be unimaginably different if they had held their ground. Story 59. Based on something I read yesterday, one fact is that when social media was being designed and built, it was never even considered that it could do such damage to our democracy. We need to understand that, in many cases, business decisions, especially those involving transformational technology, are completely blind to the severe downside their products can cause. Story 60. When YouTube changed its algorithm to favor mainstream media channels over independent sources, the entire point of the internet was to replace corporate media with something better, not to become part of it. Story 61. T.E. Lawrence helped the Bedouin tribesmen against the Ottoman Empire, undermining Ottoman power, which was part of the Central Powers, during the First World War. Without T.E. Lawrence convincing the British to support the Arab Revolt, there might not have been Saudi Arabia, the spread of the extreme form of Islam known as Wahhabism, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, the crises of the 1970s, the Reagan era, or even the September 11th attacks. There is also the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. Story 62. As much as Ruth Bader Ginsburg is lauded as a hero, her refusal to step down during President Obama's term because she was confident Hillary Clinton would win and wanted the first female president to name her successor was one of the most ill-advised decisions in United States history. Now, the United States is headed in a completely different direction with a Supreme Court that has a Republican majority. The ripple effect of that asinine choice will fuck the United States sideways for many decades. Story 63. In 1793, French scientist Joseph Dombey was carrying a standard kilogram to the United States to help the country adopt the metric system. Pirates stole the weight, and Dombey never arrived. Story 64. Al-Jazari's automata, particularly his ingenious designs like the hand-washing device, may seem minor, but they introduced key mechanical concepts: camshafts, valves, and programmable actions. These ideas directly influenced the later development of machinery during the Industrial Revolution. A single innovation, largely overlooked, became a quiet cornerstone in the evolution of automation, shaping industries and economies centuries later. The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, Kitab fi Marifat al-Hayal al-Handasiyya, by Ibn al-Raziz al-Jazari. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.